Hey there! In this video, we're going to be exploring the new DCO-60 module in Voltage Modular 2. The DCO-60 is based around a lot of classic analog polysynths of the past, but it's opened up into a modular fashion, allowing you to experiment and put your own creative twists on the classic polysynth sound. This module also features normalized connections, so all you need to do to use it is actually just route the output, and the rest of the connections are entirely optional. So right here we've got the DCO-60, and if I route the output and play some notes here, that's all you need to do to use this module, but as you see on the interface, there's a lot of different inputs and outputs, which allows us to get a lot more creative. So let's break down the final patch and what we'll be creating today utilizing the DCO-60 module. So this is a big old mess of wires and is a really interesting soundscapey type of thing, and it's using the DCO-60 more or less as the central hub or the brain of the patch, which is cool because it's like using an analog polysynth in a modular context and using that as almost your control surface. As you can see here on the DCO-60, I'm utilizing a couple different CV ins and some poly CV outs to create something a bit more complex than just what a standard analog polysynth might offer. So let's take a listen to the final sound. This whole patch is based around the DCO-60, and I'm using the various inputs and outputs to have different controls and different things happening. Let's kick things off by talking about what's happening within the DCO-60 itself. Let's unwire these outputs and take a listen to just what's coming out of the DCO-60. Within the DCO-60, it's a pretty straightforward patch. I've applied the LFO here to the pitch and then the pulse width. Then I went and adjusted the rate here down to something really slow, about 1.7 Hz, and engaged both the square and saw waveforms. For the sake of making things sound a little bit more analog-ish, I've added in just a tiny bit of noise, about 5% or so, and this is a great tip for your sound design, is just bringing in a little bit of noise to a synth patch can just make things feel a bit more imperfect and interesting. I've got the high pass filter here, and I've just got this up at about 50 Hz, just taking off any super low subby stuff we don't really need. Then I've utilized the filter here at about 2.7K. This is just getting rid of some of the air stuff, and we're going to modulate these filters here in a minute. The resonance of the filter is set down to 0, and then in the envelope, I've just set a basic pad setting here. So I've opened up some attack, dropped the sustain slightly, and then adjusted the decay and release until I got something that felt right. The chorus here is, of course, kind of the main event of the DCO-60 module. So I've got this on mode 1 here, and then I went in and utilized some CV to control a couple different parameters. In a classic analog polysynth, obviously for the controls here, you would just be restricted to what's available, especially when it comes to sources of modulation or destinations of modulation. However, because this is modular, we can do whatever we want, which gives you a lot more mileage out of some of these classic synths. So for these two filters, I've just added in some quick modulation using an envelope generator. This is a mono envelope generator, and I just grabbed the gate here, and then I routed this to the CV input of the high pass filter, the low pass filter, and the low pass filter resonance. So let's quickly hide the wires with Control Tab, and you can see I've sent different amounts of CV to these destinations. I just did this by ear, so feel free to experiment and use whatever you think sounds best. That's really all that's going on here. Now let's take a listen to the direct output of this to see what the starting point of this patch is. So not really anything too crazy, just your classic kind of pitch modulated, old school retro pad sound. Where things really become interesting is the idea of using this as the core of a modular patch, because you can take a classic synth sound and add an oscillator, or add a filter, or add some parallel filters, or add 14 different filters, or add 14 different filters and 37 delays. That is the magic of modular. To break this down, I've essentially added another subtractive synth here that's also poly, because I'm using the poly super oscillator. To break this down quickly, we have a poly super oscillator, and then that goes into a poly ladder filter. This goes into the poly amplifier, and that's really it. So it's an oscillator into a filter into an amplifier. The amplifier is receiving the CV from the envelope of the DCO-60. So as I adjust the envelope of this, it will also adjust the envelope of the poly super oscillator. The poly amplifier here then goes out to this filter. This filter is a 24 decibel per octave low pass with just a tiny bit of resonance, and we're going to start adding a bunch of modulation here in a minute. The low pass signal of this filter then feeds into two different stereo delays. It's going into the mono input, and then I'm outputting the left and right signal. What I've created here is almost like a delay network. I've got two different delays at two different times, and that's what gives this patch that kind of weird, almost granular feel. These then feed into a digital reverb, so the left goes into the left and the right goes into the right, and then I'm outputting the stereo output of the reverb. Now, of course, we want to make this a bit more fun than just some stuff into some delays, and that's where the modulation comes in. First up in the modulation chain, I've got my envelope generator here. So we've already used this for our filters inside of the DCO-60, so they then took another output of this signal into the frequency mod 2 of the filter here. If I hide the wires, you'll see this wire goes here, and I've used the frequency mod amount 2 by about 60–70%, so a pretty good amount of modulation to open this filter up. Next up, I brought in this LFO, and this is really where a lot of the work is being done because I'm using the sample and hold output of this LFO, and as you can see, it's wired into a couple different destinations. First off, I've got it going into the poly super oscillator here, into the CV inputs of the shape, skew, round, and wavefold, and you can see I've set different CV amounts here. As I'm sure you know, by using a sample and hold LFO into something like a filter cutoff, you can get that classic stepping sound. And when we utilize this same idea for the poly super oscillator, you can get really complex, almost wave sequence type sounds. Within the poly super oscillator, I also upped the range 1 octave and tuned it up plus 7.1. So this is going up a fifth, and then it's also just a little bit detuned from there. To further detune this and make things just sound a bit more organic and alive, I use the linear frequency mod input here. This is actually using the noise output of the DCO-60, so this noise goes into the linear frequency mod, and it's a very, very small amount. Somewhere between maybe 1 to 5% is really all you need, and that'll just add this kind of subtle, crackly drift to the oscillator. The sample and hold here also gets output to the yellow filter up in the top rack, as you can see. So this is going into frequency mod 1, and then it's also going to the resonance mod, so that way we're getting that kind of classic stepped filter thing and also getting some cool stepped resonance. So it's also being more resonant, less resonant, and just gives it a lot more movement over time. Finally, to bring this patch home, I've got this mini LFO, which is a very humble but very useful little module. So I'm taking the triangle wave outputs here and putting that into this poly ladder filter. So this first one goes into the mono frequency mod, and the second one is going into the emphasis mod. So since it's not that sample and hold step sequence type feel, this instead has just a smooth modulation, so again, we're just getting even more change. And this is a very powerful thing to understand when it comes to modular patching and sound design. It's just adding a lot of different subtle forms of modulation, and it can really make the difference from a basic and relatively simple patch and something that's a lot more exciting and interesting. The only other thing happening here is the square wave output of this LFO going into this stereo delay's external sync. So you could enable this and then create a tempo sync delay. Now, I didn't actually end up utilizing this because I thought it was more fun just to have delays that aren't necessarily in time with anything. And since we've got this sample and hold stepping LFO filter thing going on, it gives the patch that kind of final, like I said, almost granular texture, which I just thought sounded cooler. However, by using an LFO or a sync divider module, you could easily tempo sync this effect and have a 2-tap delay with 2 different timed values that you could then use in your track. So once you have all of this put together, you can then take the output of the digital reverb here, the left and the right, to make sure it's stereo, turn up your volume, and away you go. The DCO-60 module can be a lot of fun, and I think it's cool to be able to explore some classic analog polysynth style patches, but bring them into a modular environment to get a whole new level of sound possibilities out of them. Before we go, I want to give you guys one final tip that's just a fun modular sound design idea, and that is creating a delay network. So what I've got here, like I've said, is 2 stereo delays, but what you could do is extend this out to 4 of them, or 6 of them, or 32 of them, and wire them up in different ways and even feed them back into each other. So that way you could just play out a single note and it'll just kind of keep pinging between these delays forever. And you can adjust the different timing values. You could even modulate the time values or the cutoff, or feed certain ones into filters or pitch shifters, and you can create some really interesting sounds that way. And if you'd like to see a video on using Voltage Modular to create a delay network, let us know down in the comments and we'd be happy to do a video on that. And that wraps everything up for this video. To learn more about Voltage Modular or to pick it up for yourself, you can head over to cherryaudio.com.